welcome to another episode of Literary Gladiators, the show where we discuss and debate literature in all of its forms. If it's written work, it's game. Let's meet the panel.
I'm Dan.
Hi, I'm Renny.
I'm Dominica.
And I'm Josh. And today is a very special episode because it is the last episode of 2020.
Wow.
It is a...
Yeah, this horrible year's finally over.
Yep. Hopefully at this time, by the time we are finished filming this episode, there will be vaccines on the table and we will be free as jaybirds. Today we are going to be going over a novel that Renny suggested, Renny selected actually in the draft, and that is The Last of the Wine by Mary Renault. Renny, you have a discussion starter?
Should a historical novel ever really be considered literature?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say so, yeah. Especially like historical fiction.
I think
Yes.
literature is, the dictionary definition of literature is the art of written work. So, as the phrase for, as our motto is, if it's written work, it's game, there's also the matter of the quality of the work. If the work is being written for a market, then its literary merit can be put into question. I think the way that Dr. Bordelon worded it was, if you're writing for yourself, then your work is considered literary. And I think that this work is being written for Renault wanting to tell this story.
Oh, I'm sure it was written for a market, and actually she has other books, but she wrote a whole series of Greek historical novels, starting with the Theseus legend. She did The King Must Die and The Bull from the Sea, and then she starts with Greek history. The lyre singer, which is Simonides, who wrote the epitaph for the Spartans at Thermopylae. Look here, passers-by, the Spartans stood and died, which you get in 300 if you've seen or read 300. And then she goes on, and The Last of the Wine is second. She does The Mask of Apollo, which is about theater. I would love to have used it in a Shakespeare class. And then she has 3 on Alexander the Great, The Fire from Heaven, The Persian Boy, and Funeral Games, which is probably her weakest because she's covering dozens of Alexander the Great's generals who became kings in their own right and fought each other back and forth for practically 50 years. 2 of his generals were still fighting each other when they were 80, and the only one to die in his bed, not killed by somebody else, was Ptolemy, who took Egypt and founded the longest running dynasty there of all of Egypt, the Greek dynasty.
To be quite honest, when I first approached this book, I swore that it was about I thought it was about the Renault winery. Because Mary Renault and The Last of the Wine made me think of put the two together. But when
my manager at work asked that too. I said, does it have to do with the winery? I don't think so.
I like the Renault winery though, even though I don't drink alcohol. They have cheese plates, so I can eat
I think
that.
back to the question of the historical thing is that this is like, right, so it's not like basically just, it's in a historical setting, but it's not exactly a historical novel. It's more of a historical fiction, because I think like the 2 characters, Alexius and
Lysis,
I can't never know the person's name, aren't real people, or at least we don't know if they're real.
There
people.
are real.
yeah, Lysis was real, but Alexis, the narrator, is not.
And there's a lot of real. There's Socrates is in there,
And Plato.
Yeah, but some characters are considered fiction.
They refer to Aristophanes.
I think
let's just follow the board.
Aristophanes, she doesn't like Aristophanes because he made fun of Socrates and thinks he was responsible possibly for Socrates' death.
Aristophanes, though, he was a satirist.
Yes, he was a comic writer.
Yeah, he made fun of everybody.
Yes, but he really made fun of Socrates, and she takes we have 3 sources for Socrates. Phaedo, who's a character in there. He's the one that comes from the island of Miletus and becomes a slave prostitute. And Xenophon, who was a warrior and became a mercenary for the great king Cyrus. And then Plato. They all wrote of Socrates. They never mentioned each other, although they saw him at the same time. And they all gave different perspectives. But the one we get, and the one Renault likes, is the one from Plato, which makes him the great teacher. And he is the changer of society in a way, because he said you don't have to be at the whims of the gods, and you don't have to pray or cultivate a god. That's where we get cult from. You cultivated the god by giving them gifts and so forth. You could make up your own mind. You could ask your own questions of life and make up your own mind. And when we have those great changes in society, they tend not to go well, and for that Socrates got executed. And the book stops before his execution. It's the year before, but he's standing with the cup in his hand. That's the last of the wine, the cup in his hand. He's going to have to drink hemlock, but that's outside the novel.
I'm kind of wondering, like, how Alexius would have reacted to Socrates' death, though. That's one thing I wish we could have seen.
I don't know. He might have been there. You know, there's the famous portrait by David, the French portraitist, who does the death of Socrates. You get it online. It's everywhere.
Which actually has an inaccuracy in it.
Which has his students surrounding him, so maybe Alexis would have been there. And Lysis. Lysis, I think, is only mentioned once in one symposium as a very outstanding young man or something like that. So all of the other stuff about him is all totally invented, and Plato is, of course, totally invented.
Yeah, this is mainly Alexius's story. It surrounds him.
Yes.
Everybody else pretty much supports him.
Well, she takes it from the height of Athens and its empire to its fall to Sparta and its losing its democracy, and she does that with Alexis and Lysis also, because they have the Platonic relationship of the older man with the younger boy, teaching him how to grow up and how to be a man. But then they do, at the bitter end, fall into a physical relationship, which is not living up to your principles and ideas.
It's very interesting. I was looking into the history, ancient Greece and relationships back then, and it didn't follow the traditional physical male and physical female, as in biological or clinical definition. It was just the idea that one person had to be the dominator and the other one had to be the dominated, where...
Submissive.
Yeah, submissive, yeah.
Well, they had this as an ideal. They had the Theban band, which Alexander and his father wiped out from Thebes, which were 300 pledged lovers, the young man at the side of the older man. And theoretically, anyway, in history, if we can believe anything about Alexander, we don't have any original sources. When they died, they all died this way. None of them turned to run because they would not be embarrassed in front of their mentor or in front of their lover. Now, whether they were physical or not is not always necessarily part of it. Plato's idea was that it was ideal. It was an idealized relationship. And some probably were, it's like today, some probably were, and some weren't, because it depends on individuals and their individual interactions and attractions and urges. But I love the book, and it goes from, we saw it from Aristophanes, because he mentions the breaking of the herms in the introduction to the birds, and that's where it starts when Alexis is 15, and then it goes up to the fall of Athens and just before the death of Socrates. And if you look in the back, she really very cleverly places them wherever a major event would be. I don't know that that's easy to do. Tolstoy does it with Pierre in War and Peace. He's in every major area of Russia. Woody Allen does it in Zelig. He has this character Zelig, who again shows up, if they're signing the Treaty of Versailles, he's there. If you had the crash of the stock market, he's there. So it's one of those, a book that does that.
Is there anything you wanted to explore, Dominica?
Well, I didn't really understand about 60% of it. Didn't know what was happening. I happened to be playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey at the time of reading this, so the only reason why
Which takes place during the same time.
It takes place during the same time, and that's the only reason why I understood all the islands and their activities and all the references, was because I happen to be playing a video game that takes place the exact same time.
And his name is Alexios.
Did you see the glossary at the beginning?
Yes, I went through all that.
It's his sister, Cassandra?
I play as Cassandra.
Okay,
yeah.
I play as Alexios.
I didn't
Are
want
those
to. I read
avatars?
that he was brutal. But that's the only reason why I understood the majority of what I could understand. About 60% of it went over my head. I don't typically read that kind of story. The parts that I kind of grasped the most were the parts between Alexios and Lysis and their love story. That's what I grasped the most, and those are the parts that I had the most comprehension towards. When they started to fall into their issues that they had with one another, then I didn't even want to read the story anymore.
I think it's interesting that area is explored because most of ancient Greece is the skirmishes and sometimes the relations, as in family relations and whatnot. The greater spectrum of things, because you have relationships, but you would think that same-sex or different age group relationships would be viewed abnormally, but in actuality it was not back in the day.
Well, I actually spoiled the ending for myself because I had started to get hints in the book, and I'm not sure if maybe I was just looking too deeply into it, but I started to get hints that maybe Lysis wasn't going to survive to the end. So I actually spoiled the ending for myself with maybe about 100, 150 pages left, but I just started to get those hints. So I looked it up, and obviously it was that he didn't make it, and I just looked at my sisters who were sitting across the table, and I was like, I don't even want to read anymore. I don't even want to read anymore. Like, it was so difficult after they started to go downhill. That was the only part of it that I understood, was their relationship and everything that they had with one another.
Well, yes, she uses their relationship the way in Titanic we have
Yeah.
Rose and Jack.
Yeah.
The same kind of, you're seeing all the historical background, but it's through the prism of their relationship. And as I say, she puts them and gets them and maneuvers them into all these places, and I don't know that you could really have that in a life, although she seems to do it fairly naturally. I also think she writes marvelously. She has an excellent, exquisite, indirect style, somewhat like Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald writes indirectly. You have to read between the lines. That's probably part of the book.
I think it had one of the best openings.
Yes, I loved
When I was a young boy, if
Yeah.
I was sick or in trouble or had been beaten at school, I used to remember that on the day I was born, my father had wanted to kill me.
Yeah.
I
That's
loved
just-
really
that
attention
hook,
grabber.
that hook
Yeah.
for me,
It really
yeah.
is.
And then I
Yeah.
started to like immediately his narration style. And sometimes when Mary would go off talking about maybe like a flashback or something that happened, or she would just get wildly off topic of what was actually happening, it would just lose me. And I was having a hard time following. I feel like I would have needed somebody to tell me what was happening as if I was in school or this was a lesson. I've never read anything like it before, so I'm not familiar with it, and I was really struggling with it.
What I really like about the story is that this is actually the first time I've read a Greek story that took place starting in Athens. Because most of them usually start with, like, in Sparta, and the thing is, it's usually, like, the characters thrown off the cliff or whatever.
Oh,
the
because
things
of the
that-
warrior culture.
Yeah.
in Sparta.
Athens
Yes.
didn't have that. They had a different thing. And, well, yeah, so there was a war going on with Sparta. The thing is, he was born in Athens, so the thing is, he didn't have that.
Oh, well, I'm glad for that. Yeah, Athens, because Athens gives us democracy, drama, temples in stone with the golden mean and so forth that we live with today.
Yeah, when they fell to Sparta, the thing is, like, that's what caused Alexander to come in and defeat them so easily and take
Yes.
over.
Well, Sparta does defeat them, and it's in the book because they fought from March, which for the Latins was the god of war, in March, and then they went home for harvest. They planted, and then they fought in the summer, and they went home for harvest. But Sparta manned the passes and didn't leave. So they created a standing army, and Alexander and his father will do that and be very successful at it. And then the Romans make an epitome out of it. And we have a standing army today. The libertarians would not have us have a standing army, but we have a standing army, partly because of these events.
I don't think I could survive in a culture where I'd be married off at 13 or
Oh, yes.
to some man, regardless of how chiseled or capable he was.
Well, people didn't really live that long back then, honestly.
That's not the point. I
But
don't want to
yeah,
have
back
to give birth
then-
at 13.
But
But- and
Juliet
you'd be
is
married to
Juliet
somebody
is
10 or 20 years
13
older.
because she would have been dead, I hate to say
That's
this,
a
probably at
horrible love
16.
story anyway.
Yes,
It's like
because,
it's like the Crucible, where
Yes.
John Proctor was in his early 60s and Abigail was 11.
Yes,
12.
yes. Well, older men, as Paris in Romeo and Juliet, he's a count, so he's evidently inherited his title and his estates. And she doesn't want him because she sees Romeo, who's closer to her age, and a beautiful young man. Paris, evidently, there's nothing wrong with him. The nurse says he's a man of wax, meaning he's like a statue. But she doesn't want him, partly also because her mother wants her to want him. But yes, she's a child by our definition. And they did marry older women. Helen of Troy was only 12 or 13, and so Menelaus, he might have only been 28, but he probably already had a beer belly and a gray beard by that time. 42 was old. I also think with her narration for Alexis is she's very true to his teenage years.
Yes.
His emotions that flux up and down. He's happy, he's sad, he's confused.
I also felt that she didn't do a very good job portraying like his guilt or his grief, like when his mother died. I just felt that there was a disconnect in the humanity for some of the topics that she covered in it. I just didn't feel what I wanted to feel after becoming so close to him as a narrator.
I'm not sure how much he would have felt in our way of feeling.
Yeah, you gotta understand it was a different time back
Yes,
then, so
yes.
death was very common for them.
And death certainly was common, as you could tell. They had an epidemic during the war because when the Spartans closed the passes, everybody came to live in Athens, and they were under siege. So they didn't have enough food, they didn't have clean water, they were all packed together, and we don't know what that was, except that you could eat breakfast in the morning and be dead by noon. That was a terrible epidemic, and it very much weakened Athens. The book is obviously a very romanticized version of that time in the past, but I think that's part of its charm, and I have to say, before Lysis dies now, as I creep up to it, I start crying and cry through the whole end of the book.
That's historical novels. That's the one thing that they tend to do is they romanticize particular factions, and I think in order to attract female readers, they make it so that you have a more stronger or prevalent female character, even if history or that era doesn't necessarily.
Unfortunately, of course, because of this novel and the same-sex relationship, there are very few women, and they don't leave much of a mark. If we were a little earlier with Pericles, he had a mistress who was a famous courtesan who had a tremendous amount of influence in Athens. This was not true in Sparta. It was not true where Alexander grew up. The women, his mother was very powerful. Philip always said it was like I married another prince instead of a princess. And the women in Sparta were very powerful, but the women in Athens were very cloistered. And so most of the time you don't see a well-developed character. And she was herself same-sex, and it's that she was a lesbian, and she wrote this fiction at a time in the 50s and 60s when just to get it published was really phenomenal. And I think part of the reason she took up the past was to do it, although she has World War II novels. She has The Charioteers, and it's about the RAF fighters during the Battle of Britain, mostly being young gay men also.
Well, for me, without the relationship getting me through the first 75% of the book before it kind of turned sour and then Lysis got married, I wouldn't have been able to enjoy reading the book even a little bit.
Well, she has Lysis, marry because he would have eventually.
Yes.
That's the point, is that he would marry, and then Alexis, if he had the opportunity, would pick a young man, and they would have a relationship.
Ancient Greece is just not a major interest of mine. We went over Aristophanes, the birds. I saw some parallels with that.
And they were the same time period we were looking at.
Yeah, I did enjoy seeing the differences in the culture, and I do understand why they all did what they did with Lysis falling in love with another young child and getting married and all that. But I still stand by what kept me interested, because without it, I don't think I would have made it very far without being like, Josh, I'm struggling. Help me. So that helped me, even if it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to.
Okay.
Alrighty then. You have any final thoughts?
I thought it was a pretty good read. I like ancient Greece, so the thing is, this is just
It
right up my
helps a
alley.
lot
Yeah.
to be interested in that in Greek mythology. I'm into astrology, and I'd like to get into that a little bit more. In particular, the Western zodiac, the Aries, the Taurus, the Gemini.
Oh yeah, the zodiac.
The Chinese zodiac is different. That's the animals.
Well, that's that time period with us too. Everything is the gods and the goddesses of their influence. When they go to the games at Corinth, Alexis sacrifices so that Lysis can win. He didn't win.
And during the Olympics too, the thing is like
Yes.
they mentioned that here, only men could participate,
Yes.
and they they did it naked too.
Yes.
I remember.
I was gonna get to that.
Well, prostitutes could go, but married women and unmarried women couldn't go. And I was there in August, which was like this, in Olympia, where they held the races. They held them in August. It was 110 degrees. The Scandinavian backpackers were all in bikinis. And I thought, oh my God, to run and compete in this kind of weather must have been dreadful.
Yeah. Well, they had no clothes on, so the thing is, that was as cool as they could possibly be.
It was as cool as they could possibly.
Covered in oil and dirt.
The Olympics today, the thing is, people don't do
Well, they
that.
didn't wash. Yes, they smothered themselves in oil and then they scraped it off with a striggle. I don't know how good that is for your skin
And
either.
then they put it in jars and then like compared which one was the dirtiest, and you got in the wood for that too.
Well, they didn't have showers back then.
No.
No, they didn't have showers, but they did bathe.
Well, yeah, but like it's just like a bucket of water.
And the
Yeah.
gymnasium was the big thing. That's where all the men met, and that's where they had their lessons. You know, that was a big deal. Sound mind in the sound body. I always thought that was interesting. Wherever the Greeks went, they built a stadium and a gymnasium. And wherever they went in the West, they built a school and a church. And when the wild men were first out in the West, they certainly didn't have any need for either one.
Alrighty then. How would we rate it? 0 to 5 stars, half stars permitted. Dan?
I'm gonna 4. I like the story and the things. I'm a big fan of ancient Greece, and I do like this time. I do like historical fiction. It's just things. There's some things I wish we could have seen, like how he'd react to Socrates' death. Kind of want to read more about Alexander the Great, which you told me that you wrote stories on.
She has 3 books on Alexander the Great.
And so I might want to read those too.
Okay, yes, she's an excellent author. I had Greek and Roman literature in translation in college, and my professor there, Dr. Green, said, if you want to learn Greek history, read Mary Renault. And the truth is, if you look in the back, she gives her sources, the Loeb Classical Library, which is now online. And I found it when I was getting a master's degree at Jersey City. They had a whole wall of them. They were then little green pocketbooks. The last time they were published all together by Harvard was 1952. They're never going to put them in hardback again. They're online. They hadn't been cut. I cut them. I read all the Greek. And that's where I learned my Greek. I'm not as strong on Roman history, but that's where I learned all my Greek, because the Greeks are romantic. After all, Byron said, the glory that was Rome, but the splendor that was Greece.
And how would you rate this?
I'm giving it a 5. I would certainly never have recommended it otherwise.
Dominica?
Well, if my comprehension would have been better, I definitely would have given it like a 3.5 or a 4. But even though I loved learning about the culture, I loved learning about ancient Greece and all of that, but too much of it I was unfamiliar with, and I had a difficult time following it. For my comprehension, I'm giving it a 2.5 because I really have no idea what happened. So,
Okay.
A war happened.
It was a war.
yeah, no, I got that. But I mean, like, I loved it. I loved the parts that I understood, I should say. The parts that I comprehended, I didn't want the scenes to end. I wanted them to keep going. I thought, like, it was pivotal in the way that she handled some of the events that transpired. But it was everything else that made up the majority of the book that I just couldn't understand enough to give it a higher rating.
I'd give it a 3.5. I think that the interactions that characters had with one another, the incorporations of real-life figures into this, and I think that more so the attention that she brings to everything that took place as opposed to the things that we generally equate to Greece during that period of time was quite remarkable. It is a little bit of a slog when we're going through areas that are not as intriguing and enthralling, but I still think that it was a pretty good book. If you're interested in checking out The Last of the Wine, here is my copy, which technically is Renny's. She let us borrow.
All of them look like the same.
Yep.
They all
Mine
came
off
in at the
Amazon.
same time.
Thank you for tuning into this discussion. I hope that you made the best out of 2020 as possible, and hopefully 2021 is a much better year. Yeah, we have a lot more in store for Literary Gladiators in 2021. Let's make the Roaring Twenties the decade that we expected it to be. Be sure to join us next time on another episode of Literary Gladiators. For now, keep reading. Hi there, this is Josh, and on the next episode of Literary Gladiators, Larry, Renny, Charlie, and I will be discussing The Firm by John Grisham. If you like what you see on our channel, please support us on our Patreon, because the more money we have, the more material we can present to you, the viewer. Thank you for tuning into this video, and be sure to join us for our upcoming discussion about The Firm. For now, keep reading.